Today I'd like to begin by asking Fadyl to start the session with karakia. Thanks, Fadyl.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haramai ki ngā tangata e ngā hauē whā, mō tēnei wānanga ipurangi, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia kōrua ngā rangatira a Joe Fadyl, rauwa ko Matire Harwood, ara he karakia tātou. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa maro mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumi e hui e tai ki e. Kia ora, Warren.
Ngā mihi ki te karakia, Fadyl. Now, who is Work Counts? Well, we help organisations develop and deliver evidence-based employment support. This includes for a range of clinical and employment support teams and workers, and we see Work Counts as helping to lead a process of social change to see employment support integrated with care and treatment for anyone who is in contact with mental health services wherever they are being delivered. And so I am delighted to be hosting this seminar, and even more delighted to welcome and thank our presenters today, Dr. Joe Fadyl and Associate Professor Dr. Matire Harwood. Kia ora, Joe. Joe is Deputy Director of AUT's Centre for Person-Centred Research, and Joe has an enormous wealth of knowledge in the field of vocational rehabilitation, and her success in securing funding for and leading this very timely and relevant systemic review reflects her academic reputation and research power. Welcome, Joe. Kia ora, Matire. Matire is Associate Professor in the Department of General Practice and Primary Health Care at Auckland Medical School and a GP at Papakura Marae Health Clinic. Amongst many other things, Matire. Certainly you are renowned and much respected for your passion for improving Māori health and eliminating inequity. Matire and Joe have that wonderful quality of both being able to conduct rigorous research and being able to bring the findings into practice too. So lovely to have you here. Welcome. So it is now my pleasure to hand over to Joe and Matire.
Kia ora, Warren. Thank you so much for those introductions. I think what we'll do is we'll do a brief introduction as well to ourselves, as well as in addition to the introduction that Warren's given. So I'll start and then I'll hand over to Matire. So I grew up in Auckland. I live very near the Waitakere Ranges. And the hills, the bush and the sea are very much part of my home and my being, and I feel a pull back to those whenever I'm away. In regard to the program of research that's connected to this project, I've been drawn to inquiry and vocational rehabilitation probably since I joined the team in a vocational rehabilitation brain injury vocational rehab program in London in 2003. And in 2006, I had the privilege of joining a high integrity research team here at AUT, led by Professor Kath McPherson. And she went on to supervise my master's and my PhD research in vocational rehabilitation. Kath's moved on now, much higher up actually, but the centre remains, and I am now Deputy Director of the centre that I joined back then. And I lead the program of research and vocational rehabilitation there. My connection with Māori also is through Kath, so I think that's worth mentioning as well. The purposes of the centre focus on person-centredness, integrity in all that we do, and research that makes a difference. So I'll hand over now to Martin.
Kia ora koutou, no te taituki rau ahau ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Māhuruhuri rātou ko Ngāti Hene, ko Ngāti Rangi o Puhapu. Engari e noho anau ki South Side in Nainei. So as Warren introduced me, I'm a GP. I work at Papakura Marae Health Clinic 2 days a week here in South Auckland, where I live now with my husband and kids. And I work 2 days at the University of Auckland in the Department of General Practice. So as a GP, I see every day people coming in with long-term conditions, but also the impact of not returning to work and how this plays on their quality of life and their ability to contribute in their own communities. So very interested in this area and was thankful when Joe invited me to join the team. I've had a long-standing interest in long-term conditions and how people can live with these at home, with their whānau, in their communities, and their ability to take charge of that, I think is really important. So yeah, that's, I guess, my background. I'm just going to declare though that I've got 3 sick kitties here at home with me today, and so while I've asked them not to enter the room, I'm hoping they are okay outside, but if I hear anything, I might need to leave just quickly. So hopefully we can get through the next hour with them feeling well.
I just sent mine back to school today. He was off all last week. I'm going to share my screen, which is presentation. Hold on, I will just see if I could do that. And is that visible to others now? Great. So, like as Warren said, this project was focused on supporting people living with long-term conditions to gain paid work, and it was a systematic review. We have, oops, hang on, how can I move this? Oh, like that. We have given a brief introduction to ourselves, but there's some contact details as well. I also want to acknowledge the group of people that were involved in this project. There were a lot of people from a lot of organisations involved, and so I led the project. As Matire has said, she was involved in the review, and also she led the Māori stakeholder reference group, which we're going to be talking a little bit about today. Helen led the reference group, which is focused on mental health conditions, and I also want to specifically acknowledge Professor William Levac from the University of Otago, who had a very key role in methodology for this project. And also I'd like to acknowledge the people who are here with us today as participants. It was very kind people at Work Counts enabled us to have this graph here, put together this graph of who we have with us today in terms of what their roles are. So we have a lot of people who identify as employment specialists and also health practitioners, but also people who are involved in education, central government, research and evaluation, and also business or project coordination. So I think it's really important to acknowledge who is here with us, even though we can't do the more individual introductions. So what we're going to do in terms of the format is give you a bit of an introduction in terms of what the process that we use for the review, talk about the included studies briefly, and then move on to what the notable findings were, and then some questions and challenges that we think are particularly important that were raised by the review, which we hope will lead into a bit of discussion. And I'm probably going to do most of the talking up front because I had oversight of the project, but I'm hoping what will happen is as Marty talks to the stuff that she was involved in, then we'll have a bit of conversation going. So that would be great. I also want to acknowledge that it is a very short time frame to talk about a very long, a very involved project, and so we won't be able to speak to all the things that you might want to know, but there are other resources that will point you to that should have more information. We've tried to make it so that it's relatively balanced in terms of what we offer and helping you understand the project. So an introduction to the project, first of all. The funding for this project came from a partnership grant, RFP, that was put out by the Ministry of Social Development and Health Research Council. So they put out a request for proposals specifically on supporting people with long-term conditions into employment. And one of the calls was for a systematic review. And so I got to work contacting all the people that I knew that would be interested in being involved in a project like this. And we got together a very good group of people from a range of organisations, as you can see, who played quite different roles in the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit more to the roles in the project a little bit further on. But first of all, I'd also like to make sure that we acknowledge the definitions that we're using for when we talk about this project. So it's specifically focused on people who are living with a long-term condition. And for the purpose of that project, of this project, we define that as living with the effects of an injury, illness or health condition that is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. And so that people might experience physical, cognitive, sensory, emotional or functional difficulties, and they may be expected to stay the same, to slowly improve or to decline over time. And very importantly for this project, it was really important to acknowledge that people living with long-term conditions often experience disability, and this is why it's an issue. And that disability it's not the long-term condition that directly causes the disability. It is the limitation in the ability to participate in activities that are important and appropriate within social and cultural norms as a result of the interaction between the impairment and the context within which someone lives. And I think that's really important here. And that leads into the context in relation to paid work. And it's because of this really that people who live with long-term conditions often have difficulty accessing or maintaining paid work. So the second part of it really is that the fact that it was a systematic review of the literature, and I think it's important just to go through why you might do this. A systematic review of the literature is quite a methodical process where we're looking at research from around the world. So we look at research that's been done around the world, that's been published in various sources. We look at how reliable the results of that research are, because as it happens, just because something's published doesn't mean that it's good quality, even though we have peer review. Some things, we still need to consider that. What has been shown to work and in what contexts. We can also look at common themes in people's experiences, which was part of this project. And we can look where there are gaps, where more research is needed. And all this information can be used to inform the design of services and also to identify what future research is needed. So the scope of this particular project is, we actually did several systematic reviews which kind of came together and were collated at the end. So I'm just going to briefly outline what those reviews were. So the first thing we did was actually looking at what systematic reviews already existed in this topic. So we had other authors gone and done a systematic review which focused on gaining paid work for people living with a long-term condition. And we actually conducted, it's kind of a systematic review of systematic reviews, but it's important to have the starting point because it's good to get an overview of what's been done already. The second thing we did was we actually conducted 3 more systematic reviews which focused on controlled trials published in the last 15 years. And we identified 3 particular long-term conditions that we were going to work with. That being mild to moderate mental health conditions, amputation and progressive neurological conditions. And the reason we chose these 3 partly is because it's too big, I guess, to do a good job if you just go with everything. And we chose these 3 because they're quite diverse in terms of the experiences that people are likely to have. Like we expected there to be some variation in the sorts of challenges that people experience with accessing paid work for these 3 different long-term conditions. Another really important part of this review was that we wanted to specifically do a search which focused on Indigenous people living with long-term conditions and the research that had been published in this area. And the reason for doing this separately was because we didn't want to put any sort of limit on the methodology or the type of study when we did this. So we searched in the last 15 years of literature for that one. And lastly, qualitative research, again published in the last 15 years, also on the same topic. And I'm going to go into the reason that we included qualitative research review as well in a minute. So just to give an idea for people who are less familiar with research about what these studies actually mean. So most systematic reviews focused on controlled trials. And the reason for this is that it's controlled trials that test interventions for effectiveness. So what happens in a study, which is a controlled trial, is that the study will provide an intervention to one group of people and not to another. And then they measure the difference in outcomes between those two groups. And what this means is that controlled trials can show the effectiveness of clearly defined interventions. But in order to conclude that an intervention is effective, we need to see a few things happening in these trials. So first of all, the trials have to have a low risk of bias. So that means the results are influenced only by the intervention as much as possible. And the other thing, of course, that needs to be seen is that there are greater positive outcomes for the intervention group compared to the control group beyond what would be expected by chance. And when you hear people talk about statistical significance, that's what this means. And the other thing is that one study is not usually considered enough to prove an intervention's effectiveness. There need to be many studies that show similar findings. And that's where systematic reviews can be quite helpful because they collate studies together. The other thing that we focused quite a lot on in our project was doing a systematic review of qualitative studies, which is a less common thing to do, but we thought really important. And the reason is that these focus on experiences in socio-cultural context. So actually much of the information that we need about how to design interventions that work for people comes from qualitative research. And so, controlled trials can test interventions that had already been designed, but actually qualitative research is really important context and can help us see what might be possible. So, giving you an idea of the process that we went through, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to combine rigorous systematic review methodology with consultation with people on the ground, basically. So we formed 4 stakeholder reference groups. One which was specifically a Māori stakeholder reference group, which Matire led, and 3 more that were focused specifically on those 3 conditions that we identified to focus on in our systematic reviews. So we combined the methodology with these meetings with stakeholder reference groups throughout the process. So first of all, we got together to design a systematic review protocol, which gave us the search terms that we needed to do a search strategy to actually find the research that was out there. Then we looked at the research reports of that research and did some screening to make sure that we had what was relevant to our research questions. Then the research team made decisions about how relevant those reports were, which included assessing the quality of those studies. We then came up with some preliminary findings which we needed to review in relation to our questions, which we took back to the stakeholder reference groups a couple of times. So that was our process that we used, and we felt it was really important because while systematic reviews are seen to be very rigorous, I think it's very possible to have bias in the way that they're done, and so actually consultation with people who are on the ground was really important. Those stakeholder reference groups were made up of people who were involved, who either had lived experience, or different people in the groups, people who had lived experience, and also people involved in services and advocacy. So moving on now to talk about the studies that we found. So first of all, for the overview of systematic review, so that was the review of the reviews that had already been done. We started, one of the things I think is important to note here is that our search criteria was quite inclusive. So what you see here is there are quite large numbers at the beginning of that flow diagram, working with nearly 3,000 records to screen, but we end up with 20 at the end. And the reason for doing it that way is to make sure that we're being inclusive and we're not missing things. So from the 20 reviews that we ended up including, half of them really were focused on people experiencing with a diagnosis of severe mental health condition, and the others were kind of spread among other conditions, as you can see there. And the quality, when we actually looked at quality using the quality checklist, was actually really mixed. And as you can see from this diagram here, it was really only 4 studies that we would have considered very well conducted, high confidence reviews. And that's important when we're talking about the findings. I'm not going to go into the findings of these in any detail at all today because we don't have time, but some of it comes back in our notable findings later. But when we actually went to do our condition-specific reviews, we found that we weren't working with, we found very much less relevant research than we expected to. So actually for 2 of the conditions that we identified, amputation and progressive neurological conditions, we found no studies that fit our inclusion criteria. And when we went through the screening, what we found was that most of the clinical trials that were done in these populations were focused on either surgical or drug treatment. There was a focus on that sort of treatment as opposed to rehabilitation. Then one of the review that we did find studies for, though, was the one focused on mild to moderate mental health conditions, and we found 11 studies that focused on support to gain employment for people with these conditions. And as you can see, the vast majority of them were from North America and Scandinavia. That's the word I was looking for. And when we looked at the quality of these studies, again, it's quite mixed, but we were able to do a meta-analysis, which I'll talk about later, where there was a lot of studies that focused on one intervention, which allows you to adjust for some of that. So the included studies for the Indigenous focus review, we only actually found 2 studies which were focused on vocational rehabilitation for Navajo people. And there was one high quality qualitative study and one controlled trial. Again, like probably a disappointing result in terms of what we were able to find. And I'm going to get Matire to talk to the quality process that we looked at for this, because it was a little bit beyond the other studies that we looked at.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. What we, I think, in the first group recognise is that there probably would not be a lot of published literature that would fit the systematic randomised controlled trial criteria that you would normally expect for a systematic review. So as much as possible, we opened it up to grey literature. So a lot of the research that's undertaken in health areas for Indigenous researchers is presented orally at conferences, or it might be published in health provider reports, in Indigenous health newsletters and things like that. So we try to open it up as much as possible from outside the usual published journal articles that you would normally see in a systematic review, and get as much varied information that we could. But the second thing was that the Tanya Huria and some of her colleagues down at Otago, including Linda Smith, had just published this methodology paper around the criteria for reporting of health research with Indigenous peoples. And so we used this as a framework for our aspect of the research. And I think we fulfilled most of the criteria, which was things like meeting, having Indigenous researchers. We were clear that we would expect that if you're going to be doing meaningful research with Indigenous communities, you should have an Indigenous researcher on the research team. We looked for things like consultation, whether they were using Indigenous methodologies as part of the research, and how they would use that to implement the findings later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about our findings later on.
Lastly, for the qualitative review, again, we're starting with a very very big number in terms of the amount of studies we screened. We ended up with 82 studies, which was quite a lot, but we divided these into 3 categories. So 27 studies addressed social, cultural and biographical influences on access to paid work. 35 studies addressed experiences of trying to gain paid work, and 20 studies addressed experiences of vocational rehab and employment support. Oops. Okay, so this is a study. This is a table showing where those qualitative studies are in terms of these different categories. But you can see just briefly that people who had lived experience as a condition are the main participants that are who are providing data for these studies. Again, the countries was largely the North America and the Netherlands. Oh, sorry, not the Netherlands. I keep going for the Netherlands, but I mean Scandinavia. And with other countries, a few other countries in there. And in terms of the conditions that people were focusing on, again, it was largely mental health conditions. So moving on to notable findings, which is really what people are here to hear about, I think, but I wanted to have the background. In particular, points of importance for our local context. I think one of the really key findings in the first two of your first two studies I'm going to talk about is from this people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions. There's clear evidence that supported the individual placement and support approach. So from the overview of systematic reviews, the highest quality in most recent review, fortunately, which was very convenient to see this, showed that there was a substantial evidence supporting this approach for people living with a diagnosis of severe mental health conditions. Similarly, I mean, and it's quite different when we look at trials that are done with people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions, because this is where IPS has been modified. That this is something that is growing, and we're seeing a few studies there now, and we did a meta-analysis of the results of 7 small trials that we found, and that again showed a clear positive intervention effect for IPS for people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions. So this is a really important part of our findings. And I'm just going to draw on that high quality review that I talked about to look at what it was compared to, because this review actually did a really useful process where they did what's called a network meta-analysis, which is where they're able to compare interventions across studies and compare them against each other. So here they called it supported employment, but actually most of the studies were the individual placement and support model, and that was the main intervention tested. So just for those who are unfamiliar with it, the principles there focus on integration of employment specialists with treatment teams, personalised job search, including networking approaches, financial advice and work incentives planning, and support once working is appropriate to each situation. And I know many of you will be very familiar with this approach, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's very much a principle-based approach, and I'm going to talk a little bit more to that a little bit later on. So what it was compared with, they also looked at transitional employment, which is where there are work tasks available in a segregated environment, which is seen as preparation for paid work, and that included sheltered workshops and also doing things like work tasks as training for paid work and time-limited work with a view to transitioning into competitive employment. And the other thing we're compared with is pre-vocational training, so that being work-related training in preparation for job placement, where there's a focus on skills to be work-ready. So for example, work-related social skills training and cognitive skills training were often used for people who had a diagnosis of a mental health condition. Looking now at our review of studies that focused on people with diagnosis of mild to moderate mental health conditions, there were 7 of those studies that focused on IPS approaches, which were modified for people who are not in intensive mental health treatment. And I'm going to talk briefly on the next slide to how they were modified. There were also 2 studies which focused on cognitive behavioural therapy with work-focused components, but there wasn't really enough to draw any conclusions from those 2 studies. And there were a couple that we looked at other approaches that were specialised to particular settings or contexts, which I won't speak to. So when we're looking at IPS, which has been modified for a different population to the population that it was designed for, we're looking at what is different. So what tended to be different here was, for example, the treatment setting. So while IPS is designed for being integrated with intensive mental health treatment services and addiction, the treatment setting for this population was it came into question. So who are the team where the employment specialist was situated with? Some added principles to focus on things like stimulating motivation and cognitive strategies. And there was one study which was coupled with, where IPS was coupled with cognitive behavioural therapy intervention. And I think what's really interesting here is that we're seeing a lot of studies come through for IPS, but very little for anything else. So there were no other interventions identified as having clear support from controlled trials, and there were also no other long-term conditions that had clear evidence to support any specific intervention, both from the systematic review of systematic reviews and also from our specific reviews. And the only review that focused on mental health conditions found relevant studies. And I think this is really important to consider. And because of course we know that there are vocational interventions being used out there. But what we see, I guess, is that very few of them are being tested for efficacy in controlled trials. And there might be a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them definitely is a lack of funding for research. And I think that is related to the fact that vocational interventions are often considered secondary to treatment. And so I guess what we're seeing is that IPS is, there's a lot of research, a lot of study on IPS, but it's an exception. And I think that's an interesting thing in itself. What can we learn from that? Just looking briefly at the qualitative studies, I'm drawing out some of the most notable findings from these. I think one of the really important things is that they showed similar themes across long-term conditions. So as you saw, there were a lot of qualitative studies that were focused on people who had a diagnosis of mental health condition, but also there are a number that were from other long-term people who had other long-term conditions. And what we saw though was that there were very similar themes. And so we didn't separate out our thematic synthesis by condition because there was so much overlap. And what we're seeing is that it very much supports IPS principles for support to gain work, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more on the next slide. They also provide examples of positive effects of things like flexibility and creative solutions on workability. The findings demonstrate the importance of successful employment and work experiences for all stakeholders. And flowing on from that, I guess what that means is that what we're seeing is that the visibility of people who are living with a long-term condition coping and succeeding at work is a thing that really affects beliefs and reduces discrimination. So just briefly going into how the qualitative findings support IPS principles, we found they mapped onto the IPS principles really strongly. So just to kind of go through a few of the IPS principles that were strongly came through in the qualitative research. One being going outside traditional job advertisement and recruitment processes, opening up opportunities for people. Also access to real-world skill building opportunities that are possible now with flexibility or adjustments rather than waiting until somebody is considered work ready. Consistent messaging about workability from health and social care professionals, and also clear and accurate financial advice to address fear of further poverty. So people are often quite worried about going off benefits. Sharing information about condition-specific needs also is identified as requiring support, and I think that's something else that supports the IPS principles. Matire, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, as we've already indicated, there were very few studies that focused on Indigenous peoples and services to support them back into paid employment, or who were living with a long-term condition. The one good qualitative study that we did identify emphasised the importance of trusting relationships, which aligns with the IPS principles, both with the providers but also in the bigger community. And that inclusion of cultural practices and teachings as part of any service was really critical. The group, on seeing this evidence, did raise this issue of paid employment as being the main outcome or goal, because to us it did kind of sit with Western society frameworks and principles and values, I guess, and that came from a personal experience where I'd had a gentleman come into the clinic who had recently been diagnosed with a long-term mental health condition, and his main issues were not clinical. It wasn't about trying to treat him with medication. It was these things that Joe's talked about poverty and the impact of losing work and income for his whānau, but equally it was about his identity. And so rather than treating the medical issue that was in front of me, it meant working with our kaumātua in the marae and finding him more sort of gainful work for him to try and be more mana enhancing to him, so that he felt that he had a useful role to play as part of his community. And so it was identifying opportunities around the marae that he could engage with and participate and contribute to, that he found more satisfying, and that actually supported him to get back into an income-paying job in the end. But it was more the journey, I guess, for him than the ultimate outcome in the end. And so we sort of, while we understand that a lot of you are involved in getting people back into paid work, we would like to see if there is going to be more research opportunities and interventions that are going to support people's mana during that particular process, and we think that needs cultural principles and values associated with it. This is our group here, the very fabulous group. So we had people involved from the legal perspective. So we have Dr. Huhana Hiki there, people who are living with long-term conditions, and Emma is doing a lot of work with injury and injury support for Māori down in Otago. And so our focus was not so much about paid work, but about a livelihood which was safe and legal, so that they weren't getting into other activities that might actually be more unsafe. They didn't have those work and safety policies and processes around it, or, you know, was dodgy, I guess. So there'd been some research in this very area, particularly around food sovereignty and people being able to determine what was important to them in the community. So there was some research showing that people were doing gardens, for example, which was not paid employment, but they were actually able to get benefits from that by taking the kai home with them, but also contributing to the community, and that was really important. And so I think we'd like to see these sorts of opportunities being encouraged for Indigenous communities in Aotearoa. The other thing that came through quite strongly, and we see this a lot in health, is the layers of discrimination that can affect people in accessing any sort of service. So that somebody with a long-term condition and the stigma associated with that, whether that's mental health or neurological or amputation, often intersects then with discrimination based on poverty and that socioeconomic status and housing and things like that. And then we see another level in terms of racism and the experience of that for people as well. And these things tend to layer and intersect and actually become a bigger issue for people. And I think services need to recognise that and be in a place to be able to respond to each and every one of these if we're going to support people into a livelihood that they want to take forward from their condition. And so, yeah, we think, you know, given the recent report last week with the Māori Health Authority and opportunities for innovation and realising Māori aspirations, I think that's where we were coming from, and we were probably ahead of our time and trying to get the wider group to recognise this, which they did, and that was our recommendation back to the funders, is that we really need to support Māori-led interventions and opportunities if we're going to address the economic and health inequities that Māori experience today.
Yeah, I think one of the really important things that came through as well from looking at the studies that we did have, thank you, is that we actually, there were so few studies, well, none really, in the other review, at the other parts of the review, that actually identified that they were working with Indigenous peoples. And so we just don't know. We need to ask what is going to be, you know, what does an Indigenous-led approach look like? And so actually this sort of goes into the final parts that I wanted to talk about was, first of all, you know, what are the challenges that are highlighted, particularly in the qualitative review. I think there are two major things that I want to highlight here, although there are many more in the report and some of the papers that we can make available to you in due course. One is the effects, as Matire is talking about here, is, you know, the effects of socio-cultural norms and biases are quite significant in terms of the effects they have on people. So people talked about, for example, disclosure being a double-edged sword, where they really wanted to talk about why, they really wanted to be able to share what they were experiencing so they could get the appropriate adjustments and that they needed in the workplace. But at the same time, they felt that that opened them up for discrimination. And when people had disclosed, they talked about feeling the need to prove their worth. So people had strategies for coping with work that were actually compromising other parts of their life. And the structures are also a major influence on success, and that we could go into this in a bit of detail, but I think one of the really important things to bring forward from it is that service providers are often stretched, and they do what they are paid to do, and that can have unintended consequences. For example, you know, people talked about when placement is focused on the number of placements that people are able to get rather than the type or the quality of placements, then often the quality of the placements and the diversity of the people they were working with diminished. And that, of course, has quite important longer-term effects on things like the experiences of the people involved in that, the employers, the people themselves and their family and whānau who, you know, in a bad experience will probably decide that it's not working. And that can impact on future opportunities and future confidence as well. And on the flip side of that, opportunities, you know, visibility affects acceptability. I think this is a really important message. So the obviousness of people living with the long-term conditions, coping and succeeding in paid work is going to make a difference. And it showed, there were studies that showed that employees who had good experiences were more interested to offer positions, and that people in families with good experiences were more confident that it could work. And that takes us back to this principle-based approach, which, you know, we've seen impressive results from the IPS approach. And those principles clearly mapped onto the qualitative findings from our review. And so I think we need to be asking some questions. One being, you know, this is developed for a particular setting, but can we be thinking about transferability of those principles into other settings, with modification, of course, as necessary? And also, you know, as we've talked about already, you know, what would an Indigenous-led principle-based approach look like if we're identifying that principle-based approaches, you know, work? You know, what does that look like? And I think we need to be asking that question.
Joe and Matire, thank you so much. We need good research and review in this time of change, particularly around employment support in this context. You know, to, as you've noted, to inform design of services, you know, and particularly around cultural services. So thank you so much for your work, incredibly valuable. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you again, Joe and Matire.
Beautiful.
Thank you to the business support team behind the scenes for pulling this all together. And before we all head off into the afternoon, may I hand back to you, Fadyl, to close with karakia.
Kia ora, Warren. Mai te whānau o work counts. Tēnei te mihi kia kōrua, me o kōrua mahi kei wainganui a tātou, ngā mihi, ngā mihi, ngā mihi. Anei he karakia whakakapi. kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai, haumie hui e tae ki e.
Kia ora. Go well, everybody.